Quiver, New Weapons for Thought, a post-Elysian political project that takes thinking to be an instrument of combat. Unapologetically queer, feminist, anti-capitalist, and abolitionist.
So thank you so much, and welcome to Quiver this week. This recording hopefully will be available to us in podcast form as a sort of recorded version. We have lost Quiver 3 in the ether because of the way in which the cloud deletes itself after 14 days, and we had some hardware and some recording issues with the last one. So we're going to pick up just with the missing Quiver 3 all the way into Quiver 4. But if there's anything that people really enjoyed or loved about our last session, maybe people can drop it in the chat with some sort of reflections, and we can find some way to weave it in for this next time around. And otherwise, we're going to pick up with our discussion on exhaustion, with both a presentation discussion of bodies without organs with Brendan, and then this question of anxiety and what does it mean to live and fight within a regime of a different set of emotions, or really attuned to our present. So Brendan, I'm so excited to have you.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Thank you, everybody. It's nice to see you all again. I haven't spoken in public for about a year because of the pandemic, so I hope you guys don't mind, but I'm going to read stuff off of some prepared notes. It starts with a little bit of something from a newsletter that I send to friends, and then there's going to be one or two things about myself just as way of introduction and to situate myself within the group here. And then I'll have like one or two questions for discussion. And so that's how we're going to do it. The selection that I picked out this week was inspired by something that Gustavo brought up in February. I'm sorry if I botched the exact sense, but what I got from it was the question, how does one sustain an encounter with something like philosophy or critique, etc., that strives to annihilate the self as much as possible? A question that Andrew asked, which is also interesting, why did the subject become the site of like a privileged reflection in postmodernism, is also really important. But I left the Zoom thinking about the way that Gustavo wrapped up what he was thinking about that session, which was that once we've sort of taken ourselves up to the height of deterritorialization or whatever, how do we land? How do we come back to earth? The question is really important for me as somebody who doesn't come from a strong academic background. And I reached for this passage of A Thousand Plateaus almost immediately because it's been very easy while reading these books to feel lost or overwhelmed or confused by what's being presented. Capitalism and Schizophrenia is presented in its preface as a work of ethics. And so when I first approached it, I think I tried to think of it as something that was maybe a bit more traditional in a sense of ethics. I come from a Catholic background, but it's not a very easy work. It really resists simple parsing in that way, from my perspective. But Deleuze and Guattari are really good at making a click, which the second reading for today mentions and talks about. And one of the sections for me was this one, where this little poetic phrase, you don't use a sledgehammer, you use a very fine file, stuck with me. It brought back a couple of other things that I think about from just being a general fan of mid-20th century literature, which is that when confronting philosophy and critique, particularly in that period, the caution and the art of dosage seems to pop out as like a refrain within that literature. It reminded me most specifically of the introduction to the myth of Sisyphus, which was Albert Camus' attempt at an ethics of the absurd, where he puts this desire to confront the irrational and wild longing for clarity with a very cautious, I want to know beforehand whether or not thought can live in those deserts. On the one hand, there's this very masculine idea about it, right? Turning philosophy into a battle with annihilation. But on another, it is a very real feeling when you're coming at it from the outside or coming at it from a very well stratified position in society. A friend of mine told me, I've seen philosophy eat a few people over the years, and it's one reason why I've mostly avoided it. At times, reading philosophy or critique feels a little bit like the Jean-Luc Godard film Le Gai Savoir, in which two students of Marxism spend 90 minutes shouting critique and doctrine at one another in a dark room. By the end of it, it seems to have worked. They seemed exhausted. and they're kind of resting with their heads together, and one of them tries to rouse the other, and she doesn't quite wake up immediately, and the effect is very eerie. It's just this black room with a howling wind, and it's this feeling of what Camus describes as a chilly region where thought might survive, but does anything else. Last year, I read an interview with the auto-theorist and Afro-pessimist Frank Wilderson, in which he made this comment about revolutionary subjectivity. He says, normally people are not radical. People are not moving against the system. Normally people are just trying to live, to have a bit of romance and feed their kids. Even in the face of what is, in his mind, the most complete and total problem of his work, that of Black life in the way it's systematically and constantly framed as non-human, he still can see or perceive how those suffering the most brutal oppressions will continue to bargain with that which oppresses them. The alternative, he explains, is asking for the end of the world. We live in kind of eschatological times where the metaphor of the apocalypse has been within reach for over a decade. Maybe my interest in this area, these sort of chilly regions of thought, and the people who seek to sustain an encounter with them, is just a personal reaction to an era in which, as we've all probably heard by now, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I kind of got here through a very subjective experience. In 2011, I visited the Occupy Wall Street encampment in Lower Manhattan one week in October. I was in town for a music industry event as a student and staying in a comped hotel next to the recently reopened World Trade Center. I would walk past Zuccotti Park every morning and night on my way to and from the subway. The experience planted a really strange seed. I come from probably one of the most phenomenally privileged areas of the Western world, which is the Philadelphia suburbs. It has all of the wealth of, say, an area like New York or Washington, but none of the attention that tends to come with those places, none of the focus that comes with it. There was this sense, I'd gotten a pretty good education. My parents come from a lower middle class background, but were able to sort of ride the economic waves of the 80s and 90s in order to reach a good position, where I was sort of being prepared for a sort of, I guess you'd call it like man of the state, trying to be a part of the world, maintain institutions, etc. But by 2011, nothing was really adding up. I still had this feeling that if I just kept my head down, everything would work out just fine. But up to that point, a lot of what I'd experienced and what I was seeing had this feeling of pointing out the fragility of everything that was happening around me. I entered college shortly after the financial crisis and emerged from it the summer of the prison leaks here in the United States, which sort of ushered in this new discussion of surveillance technology in the digital world. And the training that I'd been going through was journalism. I was going to be a journalist. And that was also a really bad time for journalism. There was this collapse as digital information sort of supplanted the normal models. And so it had this feeling of bringing out something that is mentioned in the brief secondary reading on Fitzgerald's The Crack-Up, which is that the self that was being prepared arrived to a world that no longer existed, while the self that was not yet there or the self that was going to arrive was still not there quite yet. And so I reacted sort of badly to it. Academia, which was normally a place of refuge for people like me, was suffering its own privatization, and fear of debt kept me out. I moved back to the Philadelphia suburbs. If I'd known what autonomia was back then, I probably would have embraced it a little bit. But at the same time, I was producing radio documentaries about music, and I first heard about Deleuze and Guattari while working on these. It wasn't until several years later, until the larger break had occurred that sort of swept away every plan that I had made for myself up to that point, that I was finally able to kind of slip into the gap that their work opens up. And I found out that it was actually a place I'm very comfortable in. There are a lot of things I enjoy about reading Deleuze and Guattari, but it's their caution that I think endears me to them the most. This one particular section stuck out to me because of this little quote right here, which is, you have to keep enough of the organism for it to reform each dawn. You have to keep small supplies of significance and subjectification, if only to turn them against their own systems when circumstances demand it. Staying stratified is not the worst that can happen. The worst that can happen is if you throw them into a demented or suicidal collapse, which brings them back down on us even harder. So I wanted to ask the group, as subjects, what are your invented self-destructions? How do you chip away at your own stratification? And how does reading and thinking, especially through Deleuze, interact with those movements? What other things inform them? Thank you. Okay, and I don't know how to do the moderating function, so if someone could explain how I handle the little hand claps or whatever.
No, the hand claps are for you.
Oh, thank you.
Now you have to, let's see, who wants to talk.
Here, I'll start.
Hello, Gustavo.
All right. I would say thank you for the presentation. Let's just say when I was exposed to Deleuze, it was at CalArts. And I think I was a young idealistic artist, working class, really not understanding what it really meant, but I lived every moment like an artist, what everyone else was doing. But my art was different. You know, I had to survive. I had to get in debt. I didn't really understand the power structure. I didn't understand anything. So for me, it was a form of release. Like I didn't have to follow the norms, whatever the norms were. I think people around me think I'm a little strange when I say this, but I really don't know who I am at any moment. I think it's our thoughts are who we are. And my thoughts are about justice, expanding my intellectual capacity to help and aid people in need, and to find solutions to problems that obviously don't want to be solved by the powerful. And I think lastly, what this group and what Deleuze brought me was courage. There have been times where I've been alone, depressed, crying, not wanting to do anything, and wanting to be, let's say, outside of a system that oppresses and that is hateful and cruel. But the only way to do that is to invent something that is free from that. And I'm finding that there is no freedom in those systems unless you imagine them to be. So, and I think that's why I'm here. I'm here to imagine something with a group of people that are powerful enough to do the work with me for change. So thank you, Brendan, for your thoughts.
Thanks, Gustavo. Yeah, it's what you said kind of resonates with me as well. I often feel like I'm reading A Thousand Plateaus in the same way that Gerda was said to have read Spinoza. It's like more of a comfort in some ways than necessarily like a pure thought exercise.
Brendan, Jesse was asking you, maybe you could put the question in the chat.
Yeah, of course, I can type it up.
I don't want to make more labor for you. I just forget what kind of the wording, which was really, really nice.
It's not a lot of labor, I think.
I'm just paying attention to levels of exhaustion, I guess. I can.
Something that, oh, please, no, Jesse.
Are you sure? I don't want to get too personal, but maybe you're asking for a bit of that. But I read, when I first read Deleuze and Guattari, I was in a policy program, and I was not planning to go into a kind of philosophical route. Well, I never planned to go to grad school, I guess, but I was in an education policy program, and I read it, and it was like the first theory I read that I was just like, what the fuck are these guys talking like? But it also like made a certain sense, or made sensations perhaps. But I was really drawn into the idea of identity. Like I never thought about, especially in education, we talk so much about identity and these like, with lots of assumptions about the power of identity without thinking about it in the way that Deleuze and Guattari do. And so it was just like not an aha moment, but an oh fuck moment, like a moment of subtraction to realize like my own identity, which I had really held on to in my like, you know, especially into my early 20s, was up for debate for me was like mind-blowing and also really scary, because I think especially when you do have any sort of precarity, you hold on to things because they're safe, including those identities. And so yeah, I just think about that so much now, how by kind of like, yeah, confronting that kind of attachment. I also kind of came to Deleuze and Guattari through psychoanalysis, so it was a, a bit of a flip there. But yeah, really trying to think through how my identity, like those pieces, the quote that you mentioned was really nice. Those pieces like allow me to have traction in the world. I say the sun comes up like everyone else does, but that there's also that kind of like space where things might be otherwise is really creates a tension of like an ethics. Maybe that's the ethics. What do you do with that realization? How do you exist in that? And that's the question, maybe. Thanks.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, it is asking a lot of personal information for some people who might just be waking up, depending on your time zone. So don't feel too pressured to respond. But it is something that I'm curious about. Is, you know, kind of this is the thing that brings us all together. Is this admittedly very dense philosophical project, and so I was curious how everyone came to it personally.
Brendan, one other thing I wanted to share is that what I've been struggling with is being born in a world of hate and injustice. Like, why is my mother not in the same category of respect than my father? I don't really understand why all these arbitrary structures are here, because to me, they're arbitrary. So Deleuze basically, for me, was like, wow, why respect something that doesn't demand your respect, does not earn it? So we should start over. In my mind, that's what I would do. But what Deleuze released for me was in teaching. You know, everyone that I met was either scarred or traumatized or abused or had problems, you know, suicide risks, you know, whatever. I met the abuser and the abused. Most of the times, they're victims. So how are we going to save this planet if we're all victims? And who are these people that are not victims? That's where I want to find that problem. Literally, if I can read all this and I can find those people, can those people that are not victims help us? I don't think so. So we need to release all this pain and help them and ourselves, save all of us. That's what I get out of this text. And for the life of me, I don't get depressed or upset or want to give up. I want to strive and drive and run harder and faster with as many people as I humanly can forward, because that energy will heal.
Yeah, it's interesting. What you said draws like a neat parallel for me to a moment kind of deep in part 3 of Anti-Oedipus, where they're discussing economics. They're discussing how this sort of new subjectivity has arisen, where even the bourgeois are enslaved to capital in a sense, and that there's this sense that there is no outside to this machine. I feel like that's one of the great things about Deleuze and Guattari for me, or at least the Capitalism and Schizophrenia project, is that it does sort of take these very different movements throughout society and kind of creates these relationships for them, where you can kind of sense the same thing happening both to people who are affected by the trauma of capital and also this like this system or whatever, this subjectivity that's being created.
So I think my relationship to this text is kind of interesting, perhaps differently or perhaps similar to others. I actually came to theory before I came to politics. I was always interested in politics, but I was deeply cynical about it because politics was always presented to me as party politics and electoralism. And I never met a politician I liked. I didn't like the things that were talked about in the news. There weren't positions that I agreed with or identified with. And I think that's how politics is generally presented. That's the whole machine of politics. It's to enroll people to identify with certain figures and then to invest yourself within things that they present. And so it's very much about accumulating people as a sort of substance to grind through and legitimize and propel itself. So I'd read a lot of Foucault and I'd read a lot of other stuff starting in sort of late high school. And not that it necessarily made a lot of sense initially to me, but I found it increasingly compelling. And then I got politicized during the Iraq War, the very early sort of run up to the Iraq War. And I saw people holding signs on the street corner. I'm just like, what the fuck? Like, okay, you're holding a sign on the street corner. Who cares? You know, like, that's not going to stop this terrible, you know, genocide that I see, slow rolling genocide that's about to occur. And then I was in a college class where the professor showed part of the Weather Underground documentary. I was just like, oh, fuck. There are people who have politics that's not just about like identifying, it's about people who are bombing the Capitol. And they did it and they got away with it. Didn't make me want to bomb the Capitol, but it made me want to learn more about them. And so that night after I saw that, I went to the library and got Bill Ayer's autobiography about it. And I read it and I was just obsessed. It's like, there's another way through, there's another way out. And immediately the resonances with D&G became more and more important to me because I could just see how the two perspectives sort of knit themselves together. And so when it comes to a passage like this BWO, you know, I'm ambivalent on it because there are also liberals who sort of hold up this passage and say, caution, caution, you know, they're giving up the revolutionary project of anti-Oedipus, caution. I'm just like, no, I don't think so. There is this moment from Anti-Oedipus where they say, like, the problem with militants is if they're actually too precise in their analysis, like Leninists who obsess, they say, you know, there's a whole chain of imperialism, and if you take out the right link, the whole thing falls apart. Like, oh, that's a little precise. It feels like they know a little more than they really do. And so D&G make fun of it, and they're like, it's like, you know, the rebel who places the explosive on the bridge, and it blows it up so precisely that it then falls back and places itself exactly where it initially stood, and the bridge is back there again, which is precisely what I think Leninists want, right? They just want to put themselves in the state, and they're the people in control. And so in this passage, they have, you know, three targets. I'm looking at this, you know, it's the three great strata. It's right at the bottom of, it begins the paragraph on the bottom, 159. And they say, organism, signifiance, and then subjectification. And I sort of wonder every time that I read this, like, what do they mean by the organism? Why is the organism the great target? You know, why is organisms the things that they want to attack? What about signifying and signifying systems is really the target that they want? And the third target of subjectification or subjects. And not to sort of overdo this, but I was in a like an online conversation that Ed Kazarian sort of started the other day, and Steve Shaviro came in and was just like, yes, no, but he suggests this thing. He's like, psychoanalysis assume that everything sort of hinges on the subject, and we've become obsessed with the subject. You know, some people respond and say, well, actually, the subject's quite important. Just look at what Rie says, you know, the production of subjects is the most important thing under capitalism. But it's like, why the subject? Why does the subject seem so important right now, right here, right now? And I think that that's something that I've sort of investigated in terms of the politics side of it. I think politics is obsessed with producing subjects, giving you a ready-made subjectivity for you to sort of inhabit. And so I love that D&G are sort of taking their swing at it. And you know what they propose is the alternative is disarticulation versus the organism. So taking things apart that were assumed to necessarily have to go together. I like that. I love that. You know, like we were talking previously, the police, you know, what does it mean to do politics or anti-politics without the police? But then against the signifying, which is to say, let's say identity categories or things that are assumed to have to be the way they are, they suggest experimentation instead. And then against subjectification, they pose the nomad or nomadism. And I think those things probably have to be updated for us to understand what they might mean for us in 2020. What does it mean for me? I think that Politically, I'm suspicious of any group that use any subjects to sort of say that that's the core of the project. Like if they say that they're for the people, I'm deeply suspicious. Who are the people, and why those people rather than other people? You know, not just that it has these sort of Nazi implications, though I think they always will for me, but you know, even like the poor or something. You know, like for me, it always has to be minoritarian groups. And that the moment that they try and claim some sort of extreme privilege over others that need to be at the center of all conversations, I get a little suspicious. But then also, you know, these political groups, they seek power too. So I think it's my suspicion of power that is the other thing that I take out of this. And so, I don't know. Sorry, I've gone on a bit of monologue here, but these are absolutely what sort of drive my thinking and what I think this passage is really great for. It's, you know, how do you work with already existing political groups, like anything from social democrats to community organizers to other groups who have a different read, they have a different analysis, they have a different strategy, and it would be nice to just say like, fuck off, you know, I'm so different than you, I'm not going to do anything, but that's too much. You just become a loner in the process. And so I think D&G give us some tools to sort of figure out our way through that.
Yeah, the challenge is preventing yourself from falling into complete asceticism, the empty body without organs, or I think that's what they phrase it. I think Josh has something he wants to say. Or maybe not. Jose?
Hey, I'm back. sorry about that. I'm kind of running around today. Yeah, my thought about this, it's funny because the ascension, you mentioned, Andrew, like concentration camps, I immediately go to Agamben, and I'm thinking like Zoe and Bios, and the whole notion that organism, it's choosing that state of exception, like it's drawing that line and saying this is in, this is out. And that tends to be my issue with politics in general. And unfortunately, I don't have as positive a view on it as maybe some other folks do. I'm pretty pessimistic in terms of environmental eventualities and the rest of it. Like I kind of think we're fucked, and that's where we start from. But similar to what D&G are saying here, I mean, that opens you up to the possibility of creation. Like in the Stirnerian sense, in a very nihilistic sense, I think the organism you break down even further to say, you know, what is human versus what is animal. We go back to, you know, the eco angle or the green anarchist angle. I think the whole problem is like there is no nature versus a city. Like it's all nature. Everything that's built, everything that we currently live with is created from the mass that is Earth. And ultimately, long after us, we'll go back into that mass again. So the way that we manage it and creating these kind of false dichotomies, I don't think is helpful to the analysis, nor is particularly helpful to the solution in the end. You know, when it comes to my own stratification, a lot of it comes down to the way that I parent. I've got 4 kids, and chipping away at their ideas as they come up like helps me to break down those ideas myself, because, you know, we're all full of spooks, we're all full of these notions that hold us back. The police is one that, you know, honestly at our house we discuss all the time. I was having a conversation with my, you know, one of our teenage kids about probably, you know, not acceptable to everyone, but about like Ted Kaczynski versus you know, someone we saw on TV who was in the US Army. How many lives did each of them take? And one gets a parade and one's behind bars. Whose cause was more just than the other? And not telling, you know, the kids which way to make these decisions, but letting them just think about it, because we're all going to come to a different place personally. And the whole point is that we shouldn't be carrying around someone else's preconceptions and presuppositions for forming our own unique selves. Not saying that there's not things I want to fight against or there's things that I disagree with, but I do think that if we're here to create, you know, a very sharp and fine cutting tool, then I should be taking that to my own issues as well as others. I really need to be tearing it apart. And I think that that's why when this started, I jumped in a second late, but hearing all the discussion about the police, I mean, I don't give a fuck. Like I could care less who a cop is having sex with because it's completely irrelevant. Like that's a meaningless conversation. Like to point the finger at a bunch of cops and say, well, they're not ethical. Like they're doing drugs and having sex with people they're supposed to be informing on. Yeah, of course they are. Like what do you expect? And for us to take that kind of I don't know, again, maybe I'm far off on one end of this, but that just sounds like run-of-the-mill liberal progressivism to me. And it's almost a waste of time because we're shouting outrage that's really not helpful to us at all. Because what will they do? They'll hold him accountable, and that's their opportunity to reform. Makes us all feel like they're more bought into us and more on our side. And that's the kind of capture and rehabilitation we've been talking about almost every single week. And I've started to find that through this group. It's something I think about more and more and more, is really what kind of actions are beneficial to us, and what kind of actions are just immediately recuperated and almost pointless, and in some ways work against us. Speaking of, I just suggest a couple books about cops, but really just, it goes down to rethinking what they are. We see the police as this monolithic, they're this force, when in fact they're a handful of people dispersed over a huge realm of time and space. And it just so happens that we like to fight them by getting in really big groups in one place, which you would think would be the stupidest possible way to, attack that force. And the argument against militancy is kind of the same way to me. That so we, if you're sitting in the U.S. or anywhere else, really, because the U.S. is everywhere, it's the largest military force in the world. So we should stack guns and have a full frontal attack? Like, no, there's nothing really to it. So I think what D&G give us is some of that difficulty in reading D&G. And I mean, I've got less education than probably anybody in this room, so I can say that it's that surrealist aspect that as you confront it again and keep rereading. And Andrew, I picked up Dark Deluge just online, found it and was reading that. Much appreciated. Because it's through that kind of like reassociation, and you live with it for a little while, and then you come back to it again and you live with that for a little while. And it means more and more over time. And it shouldn't be an academic endeavor. Like, that's not the end all be all purpose of it. It should really be something for us to make functional in our lives. And that's what I find from it. Thanks.
I think that Deleuze and Guattari are really good at that. And one of the things I really appreciated about Deleuze, I think, is how much of like a professor he still is, even when he's writing. It informs his entire sort of like presentation of his material, which I really enjoy. Jose has something. Jose.
Jose?
Or Dan.
Oh, hello? Hello? Sorry?
Oh, there he is.
Oh, geez, sorry. Yeah, I was just saying, Brendan, I really liked your presentation and thought the question you posed is it's helpful and timely, and I think a very Deleuzian one. I guess, yeah, to answer, I guess, your question to a certain degree, actually, Josh mentioned care and like child raising. And I think it's an interesting thing, thinking of care as like ways of de-stratification, de-subjectification, or constructing a non-dogmatic image of thought as opposed to a dogmatic image of thought, which is what Deleuze is criticizing. Because care is also, the domestic sphere, also is one way, I guess, that when I first read, I guess it was Anti-Oedipus, the thing that struck me most was the way in which Deleuze and Guattari really kind of honed and perfected the way in which like Nietzsche will ask questions, like critical questions, when Nietzsche says,
I think Jose's been having some computer problems, so this might be a product of it. We can't hear you anymore, Jose.
oh no.
Charlie. Oh, okay. Jose, you done, Jose? I'll come back to you. Yeah, I was just going back to what you were talking about, Andrew. The kind of the rejection of the category of the subject. I suppose just this is sort of on a more theoretical rather than political ground, if you can make that distinction. Kind of a word in defense of the category as a pragmatic point, in that when we're talking about the subject, we can talk about it in a kind of a way that makes a statement about the political movement. Like, this is the subject of Marxism as proletariat, for example, if we want to take that line. But I think there's also a sense in which the subject kind of minimally conceived is just, you know, that which each of us is, however we are constituted. And if we don't include that in any kind of theoretical discussion, then we do basically we fall into a kind of idealism where we ignore what these material constitutions of ourselves actually are. So even in a sense, I suppose we can say that a political movement can be based around doing away with the subject, but I'm slightly hesitant about that as a goal, because I think when you do that, you take away the political movement as such, insofar as it is constituted as, you know, people who are here doing this. I think we have to say that there is a certain subjectivity, and it's the expression that each of us is producing here, which I think I would say is probably the ground for Deleuze and Guattari's you know, sort of their caution in this chapter. It's a matter of their pragmatism when we do come to apply theory to subjectivity. And so with regards to, you know, the broader question of this reading group, I suppose what limits a destratification, what prevents it from becoming, you know, cancerous or empty, is simply a grounding in being, a grounding in that which there is, just this, which I suppose I find is always necessary to bear in mind. That's on my constitution. Oh, and someone's talking about Althusser. Yeah, I'm actually doing my thesis on Althusser, so that's kind of where I was coming from.
Can I say something? I don't know how to raise my hand on Zoom. Sorry. So I was thinking also about what Andrew was saying about the three stratas, the organism, the signifiance, and the subjectification. To my opinion, the reason why organism and signifiance and subjectification are so much criticized here is because these processes try to organize and to interpret and to consolidate multiplicities. And because the only case a multiplicity can connect unsuccessfully, risking its own process, with a notion of unity or a kind of organization, is where there is a power takeover by the signifier, some subjectification process. And the organization, the signifiance, and the subjectifications are the enemies of the multiplicities. I have been always looking to this chapter as the first sister of the three sisters. They are like the regime of science and the machine of faciality, because these three stratas come again and again and again, and they are explained with the cogito, with the Jewish people, with the psychoanalysis. But I think that Deleuze and Guattari see here an opportunity to achieve their main goal, what I believe is their main goal, to establish the non-signifying, the non-subjective, and the non-organization of this body without organs. And this is what it means. It doesn't mean to, put your liver out. It means not to have organization. And this was also one of my thoughts, both personal and political, from when I started to think about how I function, and from when I started to think about politics. I mean, I like to be many things. I don't like to be consolidated. And to flow or to change or to have different lives or different aspects that I share with different people. I don't want to be one thing. And to be able also to hide through this process, to go and hide from people and politically as well. I'm very good at that. And so both personally and politically. And this is where they captured me, Deleuze and Guattari, in the political, because I believe they are political in the core. very radical, that they come from the streets and they should go back there. And I get a bit angry when they are appropriated by different right-wing neoliberal political agendas. I get a bit angry because to my core, I think inside me, I think it's not, they don't belong there.
Yeah, someone brought up last time that we should always be wary of people trying to turn these two into like the perfect neoliberals or something like that. I think that might have been Andrew who came up with that one. But it resonates a lot with me. I think one of the things that has always struck me about Deleuze and Guattari is how they manage to be radical and also very kind at the same time. I think a lot about this quote from the A to Z interview that Semiotext released as a DVD about 10 years ago, where Deleuze is asked, it's kind of his exit interview for all of philosophy or for being a professor. He's asked what the point of Anti-Oedipus was, and he says, "I just didn't want people to become a wet bag. I didn't want people to break up, like crack up." And I feel like that sort of influences all the work, and you really feel that in this particular passage, where it becomes like crystal clear how they relate to the revolutionary aspect of the work. Giving up nothing while also still being very measured and kind.
And then there's like an aesthetic, of course, to the like it's just the aesthetic, the ethical aesthetic, as Guattari might.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, Jesse, we lost your sound.
Jesse, we cannot hear you anymore.
Oh.
Hello?
Yes, you're back.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
I'm also having computer issues, end of term. It's running out of steam. I don't know what I was saying. Something about aesthetics and style, and that I think that's something that I think when I have certain conversations with certain academics, which is fascinating.
Oh, we dropped you again. Could you type it out in the chat?
Please type it.
Please type it.
Let me chime in for a second. I think what Dana was discussing is, why organize the multiplicity. The first thing I thought of was what a physicist would say. Everything is organized ultimately under, a scientific model of, the laws, right? So are they going against that idea of the laws? I think imagination goes beyond the laws, is what I understand, or creativity, but who knows? Like, I don't know. But they're posing that question. So when I hear someone saying to me, I have to live my life because, I go, no, I don't. And I think when Josh talked about, why are we pointing fingers at the police? It's a, back and forth. I go, no, maybe that's what you think, but, children, like people, like anything, you need time, there's repetition. And if you do it lovingly and you do it with an open heart, good things can result. But there are bad agents out there. So I feel like I want to strive for good and equity. So I'm one of those other agents with no organization to make that happen. So maybe that's kind of how I see it. I'm one of those particles in the fluid, and society and the world is that fluid, and I have a different shape. But so what? My shape makes everything more beautiful. Anyway.
You bring up a good point, Gustavo, which is I think that part of the thing that works so well with them is that the Deleuze and Guattari are constantly against the idea of a certain right. Really great in terms of informing politics. Don't know if we want to move on to the next one. We've been on this topic for about an hour, but I feel like the two feed into each other really well this week. I felt like they really resonated in both ways.
I see Jessie is trying to connect from her mobile phone. Maybe she wants to finish.
Hi there. Can you
Hi.
hear me? Does it sound weird? Is it echoing?
It sounds good.
Okay.
Oh, now I'm in two places. I'm fully disorganizing, everyone. I'm
Sounds great.
distributing the cognition everywhere. It wasn't that important. All I was gonna say was that there's a style and an aesthetics to Deleuze and Guattari that I think I really why I always kind of keep getting drawn back to it, and partly because when I'm in certain conversations in theoretical spaces and I mention the words Deleuze and Guattari, there's a specific reaction to it and people get kind of mad, or I don't know if other people experience this. There's like a revulsion to some of it, and comments, especially in some circles around, the impenetrability of it, or the lack of clarity, or the inability to access things. But I think it's that style that rubs people the wrong way, but it's also a style that I think is very careful, and not in the sense of risk management, but again, full of care. Anyways, that's what I was going to say. I don't know if anyone else has had that same experience in other circles.
We definitely have. Yeah, no, I think that it's the style that I think made Deleuze and Guattari work for me in a lot of ways. I tried reading other philosophy before, and it just had never quite clicked. I was sort of the opposite of Andrew. I came to politics before I ever got to theory, but politics just felt kind of strange and like weirdly bereft without any theory involved. And so when I finally was able to like make the connection between the two, it was actually really helpful.
I mean, one quick thing. I mean, for me, politics is survival. So I think when I see you and Andrew, I don't see, at least in the States, it's a privileging of a certain type of male white privilege, right? I'm going, I was the person that was not white, but I was male. But when you're told that you have less value than someone's shoe or property, or when you're not allowed to go in someone's house because you would stain the children that they've actually are trying to groom for something. When the Klan comes to your home and says, we'll burn crosses and burn you and kill you if you stay here, the only thing I can think of is why? They're afraid of change. I see politics as weirdly combat. Like, if I don't have politics, I can't survive. Seems like the quicksand at every moment. So for when I saw Deleuze, I'm like, oh wow, it validates that quicksand. So now I'm not crazy. And how do I save my friends and myself? So I don't know what that means, because I'm still now at my age, now 30 years reflecting on this, I'm going, wow, we are in big trouble if we don't find a way to change now. Andrew, when I met Andrew, it literally lit something in my head, and I was like, that's right. He's actually took a stand. And that's what we need, is to have enough heart to move it forward. So that I'm here because of Andrew, but then I'm also here for the people that I need to help moving forward.
That's a good point. To talk a little bit about just sort of the political situation that I grew up in, I was a speech and debate kid, which has specific connotations in America. And I was in speech and debate during the Bush years. And so there was this very weird cosplay going on, like, the neocon movement of putting a little flag pin on your lapel. These are like, these are kids who are doing this, and they're performing this weird costume drama of politics, and they would fight in the sense that you talk about, but there's nothing behind it when they would fight. And they would always be, citing like Heritage or Cato Institute, like these far right think tanks, and treating it as if this was some sort of revolutionary thing, was that they wanted to rip the welfare state apart. And that was a very crazy experience coming from sort of a left, probably closer to neoliberal background growing up, of just like, what is going on? And so, at that time, the left, especially to a teenager, felt very sort of like in retreat. And so it took a long time to sort of find that level where it was like, oh, okay, this is actually a politics of survival. This is actually something that is necessary and has a theoretical backing for me. Okay. Anybody else?
I could jump in. Sorry, I missed the first hour. I forgot the whole daylight savings thing, so I might be a bit disoriented, maybe reference something you've already talked about, but I'll just say what I have in mind. First of all, in conjunction to the question, which I saw in the chat, and thank you, Andrew, for reposting it. What I immediately thought about is linking today's sort of reading with the last week's, with the refusal of work, and the kind of how to have a sort of micropolitics of the self, which refuses the subjectivity you have been endowed with, or rather the subjectivity that has been imposed upon you. I was thinking of various minute ways of undoing your habituation toward work. So, once again, it says that they even reference that, the body is organized so that capital can extract useful labor value from it. And I'm also thinking here of, Foucault's discipline or Bourdieu's notion of the habitus, and especially how school prepares you for these things. How school teaches you, well, at least if you're middle class and in a certain orientation, to sit in the same position for hours on end, so then you can do this in the office. Or at the same time to obey and yet another voice of authority, which is now the voice of the teacher, etc., etc. And in this sense, how you can start refusing these things on a very habitual and very bodily level, and therefore undo your discipline in working towards a refusal of work. But then once again, the whole notion of caution has to be how to do this without completely distracting yourself, without making yourself unmanageable in the sense that the refusal of work is going to cost you your life. So there's this very fine line, right, between the privilege to refuse work and still survive, and the militant tactical refusal of work towards an anti-capitalist liberation struggle. And I think going back to the Thoburn reading, this is kind of what was achieved by the Emarginati, who led this kind of exodus and created new spaces of life, new spaces of production, even though there were some of the most marginal sections of society. And I was thinking what you were all thinking about that, whether anyone has also thought of refusing the kind of bodily kind of disposition that you have been imposed upon toward refusing work, etc., etc. Thank you. I'm sorry I'm late.
No problem. Thank you for contributing. I would say I think that kind of feeds in really nicely to the discussion in the next section. So should we move on to that and pick up from there?
Yeah, I don't know if you prepared maybe some introductory notes to the Plan C thing, Brendan, or if anyone else is quite familiar or struck with it, and maybe would like to do that introduction himself. I see that Alex has a hand up, so maybe Alex would like to sort of jump in.
Just real quick, I kind of wanted to say something about the last part. I'm thinking a lot of hearing words like science and school and work. And when I was reading this, I was really thinking about those are identities and organizations that are imposed on us. And I was really thinking to me, that's what the body without organs looks like, is denial of organizational categories. And I think that not just work, but things like science are also something to really challenge for ourselves. And I think of science a lot. There's I don't think that there's an objectivity to science. There's always some sort of position that people are coming from. And when it comes down to it, it's just, I think it's a lot of words that we're trying to explain phenomenons that are happening in patterns around us. But I think science with capital S is one of those organizations that we are trying to push ourselves away from, as well as good or bad or minority groups. And I just wanted to say that for the end of that. Thanks for letting me speak.
Awesome work. A really great intervention. Is there anyone who would maybe want to jump in with Nancy? I know we didn't ask anyone this time.
I haven't prepared anything, but I could, if no one else wants to introduce, I could maybe just say a few lines of what it says. But I think it would be better if, I don't know, somebody else wants to talk, because I have the sense I talk a lot sometimes.
I've read this before. I don't have anything important, but I could do a quick summary. I don't have any specific things or interventions to say, but I found this before I found theory personally, because I was tabling zines and living in anarchist houses, and this was one of the ones that was on our wall constantly. But it also reminds me of a text called Bolo Bolo with the Plan C. But the idea that I got from the zine or the essay or whatever it is that capitalism is always changing its affect upon us, and post there was workers movements that were really powerful in the 19th century, and then around World War II we kind of see that the affect, excuse me, the workers movements were really powerful because there was an exploitative relationship where the dominant affect was misery, and specifically like misery of work, not having the same kind of like health benefits that we do. But then around after World War II, with a new kind of industrialization, we had a lot more luxuries in our household. And the thing that becomes the defining affect is boredom. And I think the situationists were the ones who really talked about that in an interesting way. We could look at like May 68 as trying to attack what the defining affect of it was. I think an important part of this essay too is that they talk about that there's always an unspoken public secret that is the affect that's defining us. And once that is spoken, and once it stops becoming a secret in public, capitalism or whatever the dominant oppression or dominant powers are must redefine itself. And they go on to say that the new dominant affect is anxiety specifically now, because boredom is no longer the public secret. We could point to things like leisure time and different abilities to fight boredom as kind of changing that terrain in a different way than the 1960s of pushing a button at a factory. But now we see it as anxiety and fear. And yeah, that's I have something.
We cannot hear you anymore, Alex.
I'm having some computer issues.
I can take it from here. I mean, you were saying that the dominant affect today is nor misery nor boredom, but it is anxiety. And we are anxious, we're living in precarity, we are in insecurity, and this anxiety has spread everywhere inside the social field as a new form of subordination, let's say. And also, there are many ways to see this anxiety, many roots behind it. For example, surveillance is one of them. It's spread everywhere from work performance reviews to national security, prisons, of course, or constant examination and evaluation in the educational system. And also the ideal success story that haunts us from the inside, like where we should end up, and if we don't, it's our problem. There is, of course, a voluntary self-exposures through social media. It's this visibility that is making us perform ourselves under the gaze of virtual others. And the public spaces as well, bureaucratized and privatized. The human activity is forbidden sometimes due to health or risk or security issues or antisocial behavior. Communication becomes essential. We are commanded to communicate. We are obliged to communicate, and the system threats us with the withdrawal of this communication, such as temporarily bans from social media, for example, or benefit sanctions, or of course, solitary confinement in prisons. And this whole pleasant condition described in this text is the regime of control by anxiety. A creation of a condition of constant danger, leading to a collapse of personality, if I'm saying this like in the words of the text. So the dominant affect is of anxiety or precarity, is treating people as disposable, not in the sense of deprivation of the necessities of life, as misery would do, the affect of let's say a century and more ago, but in the sense that these necessities of life are available, just they're out of reach, or they are withheld conditionally. And of course, precarity is everywhere, from the workplace to our everyday life and politics. And so it says that as anxiety is this public secret, it is not discussed. It is discussed when it is discussed as a psychological dysfunction or a bad thought pattern that we are blamed for. And then dominant narrative favors more stress so as to be safer and more competitive. And the more the securitization of the overregulation, the more the anxiety, forming this vicious circle and increasing the anxiety at the end. This is, what else can I say? And the communication, of course, it's very, although it is excessive, it's very superficial. And so the current tactics and strategies are not working because we have not articulated this public secret. And we have to find new theories to combat this anxiety. And well, it is true that I'm also looking at the text, that during periods of social mobilization, people feel more empowered, or with a feeling of disalienation. But there are tactics of the system that involve preemption and punishment by process, like mass arrests or stop and search in the streets, lockdowns, house raids, and more, or punishment by process, like pre-charge or violent dawn raids, exposing names and faces of the pre-charged in the press, etc. And we need a machine for fighting anxiety and not boredom. We have to go forward and to find a machine that is fighting anxiety and not boredom anymore. And what should be done is, well, the text proposes some methodologies. First one, we need brand new theories that come from our experience and not the past phases of capitalism. Those experiences should relate to this public secret and should be expressed publicly. Second, to recognize our anxiety as real, that our problems are not just personal. The third one is that we can transform our feelings if we can talk about them, and this way we can recognize the injustice done. Fourth, we can raise our voice, because this culture of silence must be overthrown. and the articulation is one of the most important parts of the processes. Fifth is constructing disalienated spaces like communities, meetings, not as self-help, but as spaces for reconstructing radical perspective. And the last thing is to analyze and theorize social sources based on similarities in experience, to transform them by theorizing and analyzing them, and change the meaning of these experiences, these common experiences, and find patterns and see problems as symptoms of a wider structural problem and not a personal bad thought pattern for this anxiety that we feel. I mean, más o menos. Gustavo is laughing. Sorry for my Spanish.
I know Brendan had his hand up, but can you hear me okay now? I put a new computer on. I'm sorry, I can't help but think about what you're saying, Dana, in relation to what's happening in the chat right now. I just want to, I don't know if it's worth taking a moment to, there's just a limit to communication, the channel of a chat, right? That striates information, makes our expression go a certain way, or like, so I don't know.
I just wanted to go back to, I guess, Dana's point and her wonderful summary about anxiety. And just to think about, if and I don't know if this is true, but if the religious project and the economic project is to organize people, ultimately, what was the vision of those? Why the organization? What was the ultimate purpose? It was dominion over the earth, let's say. But if you're destroying and killing everything that's under your feet and that you breathe and in the sky, then isn't that suicide? So do we have a mass anxiety of suicide? Does half the people want to live and the other want to die and they don't know? So I'm just curious, like, let's say that if our project is to relieve anxiety, what is that relief? Because there's, monetary anxiety, but then there's spiritual anxiety and there's conceptual anxiety. So maybe that's also something to think about too. It's like, what is that gradient that we're trying to shoot for? And not to challenge, I'm just expanding my imagination here because I haven't really thought about it until recently. It's like, wow, I feel like an abused person. And if you see child development, if you're a calm parent who's healthy and wants to, impart some love, then the child grows up that way, usually. So, and, within quotes. But if you're like a demented, tortured soul, you can see someone with a pet and their pet is a demented, tortured pet. So, not to say that we're pets, I just want to think about thank you again. I'm really struggling with the idea of being on this earth and not living my truth. So I will confront a racist or a non-racist. To me, I don't care. They're human beings. But I just want to move forward together, if possible.
I see also Brendan and Jesse, but if you allow me just like 1 minute, Gustavo, you know your place in the earth. This is this is it, and I wanted to just remind you that in the text it doesn't talk about relieving anxiety, but it talks about a machine that will fight, or that anxiety will be used to be transformed into anger. Because the problem with this anxiety is that we are feeling powerless. We're feeling lost and powerless. So we have to, it's a struggle. It's the system that is causing this as a methodology of subordination. So it's not so much for me about relieving it as to using it and to making it action. Sorry. So Brendan, Jesse, I don't know. I don't see who is the first.
I wanted to start by just saying that I know people were sounding off in the chat while we were doing the first module today. Sorry, I wasn't responding to that. I have a really poor ability to multitask, so I try to avoid the chat as much as possible because I just sort of lose track of what's happening in the conversation. But I really enjoyed this reading. It kind of brought me back to the first reasons that I started to get into reading critical theory, which was that I was trying to find a use for journalism in a place or a time where journalism and writing in general seemed to have lost all value or all ability to really challenge anything. There's a really great book that came out, I think, last year called The Twittering Machine by, I forget the name, but I'll find it. But it comes to this idea that, in the last 10 years or last 15 years, we've seen the growth of the largest writing project in human history. And its craziest or its most out there sort of expression is in the website Twitter, of course. With the sense that, like, we've reached this place in journalism and within mass media communication, which is that this idea that drove mass media, which is that more communication is always better, and the more communication that's happening, the closer we're going to get towards the perfect version of how this world should work, has clearly fallen apart. Like, we've reached the end of that illusion. And we've come to this place now where mass media's role as sort of enforcer of dominant paradigms while also just producing negative affect over and over and over again in order to enforce those paradigms is just like it's our daily lives, and we're all aware of it to this point where it becomes a common joke that you're stepping away from social media for a few weeks and then you're immediately back on. And so in a lot of ways, what I really enjoyed about this was the way that it was able to reframe what was happening. I hadn't thought about it from this idea that I hadn't thought about the 60s from this idea that we were trying to fight boredom, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about the proliferation of different attempts to, or different modes of communication, different channels of communication, et cetera. And so I found that really exciting or unique about this. I feel like by the end, it doesn't quite take itself all the way to the end of where it needs to go, because it still falls back into the idea that communication will eventually right itself. But from the perspective of creating this sort of like these three eras since the Industrial Revolution of what is being fought or what capital is using as a dominant affect, I found that really great. And I think it kind of gives direction, at least for a political standpoint, of where to go next or how to try and figure out what to do. That's all I
got. Thanks, Brendan. Can everybody hear me okay? I think computer 3 is working, which says a lot about my own setup here, my access to things, that I can have 3 different options. I was just thinking, Brendan, as you're talking about this book and article, Sad by Design, I don't know if anyone's seen it, Garrett Lovink, who writes about, and I'm just thinking here about this, like, yeah, how the channels or the media is the message, the way in which something is set up already kind of creates a certain mode of expression or possibilities for expression. And I was just gonna, this essay has been so big for me. I send it to so many students, the one about anxiety, because I teach a lot and I work with youth a lot, and indeed everybody is very anxious. But it becomes, I don't know if many people have had chances to think about it beyond an individualized kind of condition, and this relates to so many like anxiety management strategies that circulate out there, which is a whole big business, of course. So I've been trying to think about this in education, and like, I think education, and thinking of Harris's comments and other people's comments, education is also a certain kind of like structure for communication and imposes certain ways of organizing oneself in relation or not, in spite of the world. And so I've been trying to really think through, and with people like Andrew and Jose and others, about this, like, what is the site for, and I guess this conversation, based even the earlier one of the other texts, there's this like interesting tension, I think, always between like the radical response and then trying to have some sort of hook into the practical conditions or material like spaces that we occupy, whether it's at the university or in schools or in your family or at your dinner table with like your racist aunt and uncle. In some people's cases, like what's the mode in those moments when there's a definite kind of like theory or like response that I personally want to make, but then there's all these other conditions that impact the response. And I think for me, that's where the Deleuze and Guattari's work really resonates, again, partly because of these like cautions, but also because of the like facultative, like the ethical nature of it in terms of how there is no one response, right? That it has to be kind of based on the specific conditions, and it's based in experimentation. And then, you know, you might not ever kind of like, fully relieve anxiety or overcome these kinds of things. But then how do you work together to collectively kind of fight? And so, yeah, I've been thinking about this anxiety question and especially with COVID, like, I don't know if anyone else has pals or loved ones who are teaching right now in schools. But my sister teaches in a grade 4 classroom, and one of the biggest things that she says is that there's like no mention of the pandemic on most days. And that partly relates to where we are in Alberta here, where there are lots of cases, but we're also, I won't go into a full thing about Alberta, but it's easy to disappear a lot of the things that are happening because of space, money, privilege, all sorts of things, whiteness. And so in her school, there's never really talk about the changes that have been made under this like new normal, but she is so, like, her and so many of the others are so anxious, but meant to feel so on their own. And so it's not only alienating, but there's no kind of shared reality that they can kind of fight against. The realities are not, and therefore it becomes this like very difficult kind of situation to kind of organize against. And so, yeah, I'm just thinking in this conversation, when I'm so excited and reading so much and doing my PhD and thinking about these theories, but then back in these other spaces where there's a different response, and how to kind of work within that space in order to, and also in my case, like, I never want to, I think there's a danger in like assuming that I'm like going to be able to spread some sort of gospel of, or like that I somehow have figured it out. But being able to respond in those situations with care and like with vigilance, and but also in a way that takes into account people are coming from different places. That was a long-winded way to say some things. Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you, and thanks for listening.
Jesse, I wanted to say that, you know, saying your truth is extremely important, and I wouldn't be in education or I would say somewhat healthy human if I wasn't very truthful and honest with myself and those around. So I honor you and everyone here by trying to be truthful. But how do we come to a solution if we're hiding and we don't know what's going on? And I think maybe that's how I've lived most of my life until recently. I'm like, whoa, where am I? So anyway, thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Brendan, for the wonderful contributions. One thing I had in mind that I really want to bring here today is I was really excited by the question Andrew and Dana said about Fitzgerald's crack-up. I thought it was brilliant. Actually, this is one of my favorite plateaus, if not the favorite. Which is, I'm in the minority in this sense, but I think one very interesting thing is to try and think how this might relate with anxiety. Because to sort of give a very brief introduction for everyone, kind of idea is that our lives and our subjectivity, ourselves, are determined by 3 kinds of lines: molar, molecular, and lines of flight, which are also molecular, but they're more special kind of thing. And in this sense, the molar lines are the ones that take us from school to work to army to retirement. Essentially, they're the great overdeterminations of the strata which are imposed upon us. And there you have breaks. From one context to the other, you have breaks which, in a sense, are predetermined. They are part of the authority structure. Then you have molecular lines. In a sense, these also involve breaks, but they're not exactly breaks. They're what they're trying to get at with a crack-up. They're essentially a sense of destabilization, something that pulls you away from the dominant stratifications, but does not allow you to escape them entirely. It takes you from one strata to another that it's perhaps looser, it's perhaps another relationship to the strata, but it's not the rupture. I'll come to the rupture in a little bit. And in this sense, they discuss Fitzgerald's The Crack-Up. And it's this essay after he's become a very successful writer, but he's also having problems with alcohol. His wife, Zelda, has problems with mental illness, is slowly getting worse and worse. He's getting worse and worse. And what he says is that it always comes, he says, at the moment of great power or great standing. Whenever you feel the surest, that's when a crack-up comes. But then you can trace it only after you can go back and do a kind of cartography and see the events and conditions which produced this kind of crack-up. And from what I'm thinking, I don't know how Andrew and Dana thought about when posing the question, but from what I'm thinking, this is a relation with anxiety. The crack-up is a kind of anxious burnout. And speaking of this, we can also think of Byung-Chul Han's book, The Burnout Society. I think it's very close to this text we're studying today. In a sense, it's also a very ambitious text, perhaps a text that tries to do too much or tries to argue too much. In a sense, it's all in what I said about the other text as well. It might be Eurocentric to say that there's always a danger. When saying we've entered a new paradigm, this is how capitalism works now. There's always a danger of just describing the cutting edge of the West. Not even the West in its entirety, right? Just the West, the metropole, let's say, in the West. But in any case, this is the kind of anxiety of the crack-up. And then there's the rupture. The rupture is the line of flight. It's also molecular, but it takes us away from stratification in its entirety, if such a thing could be. In a sense, it fights the strata. Not only does it establish a different relation to them, it establishes a relation of war. It's what the war machine does, but it does not have war as its object. War becomes its object when it faces the strata, when the strata try to cut its line of flight, its line of otherness. And in this sense, what Dana emphasized, right, to produce a machine fights anxiety, a machine that wages war on anxiety. For me, it's a question of turning the anxiety-fueled crack-up to a nomadic political and revolutionary rupture. So going from the burnout and converting, transvaluating even all this anxiety into a different affect and using this affect to destroy the machine that produces the anxiety. And this is also using the weapons, or even the effective weapons that have been produced, the very subjective, to relate this to the first text, the very subjectifications you have been endowed with, turning them into a weapon, into a quiver against the very systems that produce them. Thank you.
Really great intervention. Love the way you're winding in the secondary reading on Crack-Up from the three novellas plateau. And, you know, I wonder how this does or does not relate back to very classic sort of Marxist dialectics, which is to say that in, you know, like a Marxist dialectical formulation, you know, every era has its own substance and contradictions and antinomies. And what happens is that in that particular moment, it's that substance or material that can be turned back against its own sort of source. So, you know, under the feudalist states, the peasants could rise up with the pitchforks against the feudal lords. In our era, you know, we're endowed with smartphones by Apple, which we can then use to turn against the very system that produces it. And I'm wondering, you know, are we just back to that sort of dialectical formulation? You know, by any means necessary, use what's in front of your hands in order to sort of fight against it, and that, you know, capitalism will be its own, will at least invite its own gravediggers. Are we thinking of it maybe perhaps as just a slightly different process, or, you know, is this just like such a universal strategy that we shouldn't try and fit it into any one of these sort of philosophical boxes, and perhaps we could have slightly different approaches that would render slightly different results? Do people have any ideas on this? I'm also just sort of posing it as a question that doesn't need to be answered either.
On some level, maybe that entire article is just a really great propaganda piece for anti-civ thought, or even post-civ thought. And I think that's that's all I can think of when I read that, because we like to take these things and these pieces of technology and see them as these tools with, you know, no morality, no social significance behind them aside from what they can do for us, and we'll just recontextualize them. But even if you want to look at it from that, you know, Marxist dialectical kind of perspective, as we're spiraling, like, what are we spiraling towards? So unless you're a transhumanist, like, where the fuck is this going to go? It's either going to take us to, you know, utter oblivion or utopia. Like, those seem to be the two options if we want to continue along the technological lines that we're currently following. So possibly, you know, rejection may be the only option, but is it even? Everything's kind of so entrenched. I think back, it was, you know, years ago, being down in Haiti, and I'm in the middle of nowhere in Haiti. People have nothing. I mean, they literally hardly any clothing, and you're purchasing fuel and, you know, used water bottle containers that they find in the garbage, but people have cell phones, or at least a, you know, pay-per-call phone. So there's still that connection, you know, to this dominant European culture that we're all talking about right now. So at the end of the day, I would personally be more of that anti-civ or post-civ direction, that I don't think these things serve us as human beings. And I like talking to you all, but at the same time, you know, being able to scale our thought and our level of concern to this global level is the same issue, I guess I see it looking at the world and trying to explain it at a molecular level. Is neither of those really explain the human condition or are necessarily beneficial, you know, for our flourishing. So that's it.
I think just riffing off Josh's point, where this question like hits home for me is around a more kind of like critical disability studies, things like this technology question. It becomes much more complex when we like think about all sorts of technologies, and thinking of other people's reference, maybe Brendan's, to this like apocalyptic imaginary, where it's like, you know, I love Claire Colbrick's take on that phrase. Is like, it's a cute phrase to suggest that this, like, what we deem as the end of the world is just the end of affluent capitalism, right? Which many people have maybe known as life for much longer than myself. And so, yeah, like this question of technology, and can we like be, or like how this question of machines and our entanglement with machines, which is a smartphone or Zoom I'm intimately entangled with through labor and all sorts of things, but it's different than like the meds I have to take that as of this moment seem to be for the near, or for the, my question to my specialist was like, but what about the end of the world? Like, what do we, like, how there's certain technologies that, thinking of this kind of human condition, Josh, that you're kind of referencing, that raises questions about the human that have come up today, like what is this distinction between human and non-human, but also that there's these technologies that become part of our ways of perceiving the world, and how do we, yeah, and then the bigger question there is access, right? Like, so who has access? And so here's a really, I think, interesting way to think about these machines, where like people are synthesizing insulin, or like really taking hold of the means of production, maybe in a dialectical way, but also in this, I think Harris made this comment, it's that transvaluation of the machine. Like it transforms in a way, not just materially, but the way in which value, or in this case, like livelihood, like life, maybe is thought. I don't know. That's a bunch of mixed up thoughts to add to the mix here.
I think the thing that Josh mentioned too, I don't know why I go after Tenki so hard. I'm so sorry, folks. But that, like, the thing that Josh mentioned about the, you know, if it's dialectical, where does the spiral go? I think it's an interesting question we should pose to traditional historical materialists, like if this is a tweak on historical materialism here, because, you know, there are so many Marxists who are deeply committed to rationalist, modernist, well-built, efficient state projects, which I think is ultimately our, or I don't know, maybe I'm irresponsible by saying it, but my project, and that they've done enormous amounts of violence by assuming that they're, let's say, guided by reason, or that they are modernizing peoples who are resistant to it, something like that. And so I would hope that when we come up with the way in which we're responding to anxiety or sadness, or even like trolliness, which I think is quite common, at least in the United States, with all this sort of post-Trump alt-right weird sort of internet stuff going on right now, that coming at the other end wouldn't be, let's say, more civil communication. It wouldn't be more thoughtful communication. It wouldn't be any of the sort of bill of goods that were being sold by the tech flash that's going on right now, where a lot of these like tech firm people who used to be designers are sort of leaving the companies and then going on a, you know, very well-paid speaking tour, telling people, oh, these are the negative byproducts of social media. Now it's hard to build community, or that there is fake news and misinformation. Like all of the solutions that those people are presenting in so many ways fit perfectly in this dialectical model of just further refinement. And so maybe what we're looking for with the We Are All Anxious text, or maybe the proposal that Harris is giving us, or Jesse's sort of provocations here, is also moving beyond the refinement approach. Like what's coming with the so-called apocalypse? Like what are the things that need to end, which gets us to what Josh was talking about and other people too, which is there's refusal. There's an against that's happening here that's meant to push us into a wildly different way of life. And I think that unless we invite the question of things really radically transforming, I think maybe we're not thinking enough. And so to return to the Crack-Up text, what I think that we get in the Becoming Plateau, as well as the question of the 3 lines and 3 novellas, is that each one of them are sort of thinking of the question of transformation. And we can think of a Marxist, traditional Marxist-Leninist approach to transformation as like a single punctual break. That everything previous ceases, but then the new thing is basically still a refinement or redevelopment of it. I think the molecular is still a lot of liberalism, maybe let's say constitutional liberalism or Republican liberalism, which is about refinement through mutation and shifting and changing, which is where a lot of Deleuzians get sort of stuck. They get sort of stuck in the sort of like, we're going to keep sort of mutating, shifting and changing. Don't tie me down. I'm going to build new connections, that sort of thing. And I think this is where DNG really start sort of drawing down on this, being like, oh, we need to worry about this because this could be, it could end here and we don't want that. And I think we get that later with, let's say, the nomadology plateau, where they say, hey, that's just, you know, the liberal side of the state. That's like reformism, that's welfare, that's UBI or whatever, the most radical form of state socialism is today. And so then we have to imagine like what really does, what gets us to the rupture? What is a real rupture? How can we imagine rupture today? And it's not just a rupture within, you know, halls of government. It's not rupture within the everyday life of a small group of people. It has to be rupture in such a significant extent that it hits everything. And so maybe we get back to the BWO section that Brendan presented, where it's a rupture at least with organisms, which is to say all the organs of society, from the family to the globe, the earth. It's within signifying systems, which would say, you know, language, the words we use, but also the images, and I guess, you know, Brendan's intervention talked about all forms of communication, digital communication. So a rupture in the communication systems and meaning making. And then the last one was subjects and subjectivity, how we define ourselves, the experiences that we have, and the connections that allows us to have with each other. And so not that it's a blueprint, but I think that, you know, the use of philosophy is often to provide a model. And so I think the model that's being presented here is that those 3 things need to be disrupted, and we need to look for a transformation in them that's not just a single break or a rupture, but what does actual, I mean, not rupture, crack up. So not the molecular or the break, but what does the real rupture look like in all 3 of those arenas? And I'm far too humble to think that I have the answer to that right now, but I think that you all can come up with some good ones. On the other side is whatever we might call like a communism or something for me. But, you know, I don't mean it in any of the traditional sense of communism, of course.
I just wanted to just bring to your attention, I put a link on the town hall from last Friday from UCLA about the killings that happened last week. And this may not be, this may not scale internationally, but it was one of the first times I've seen a group of professors that were tenured and people from the community really speak their truth. And I guess when I witnessed it, I wasn't really sure what I was seeing, but I heard people from different generations articulate living in anxiety and fear, and really just asking for compassion and for solutions. So, that's how I was informed today, and that's how I saw the lens of these readings. Like I heard their plea, and I want to be not only an ally, but I want to be a colleague to move forward together in harmony, if that is even possible. But and I thank you again, Andrew, Dana, and everyone here. Thank you for your thoughts. It's really helped me a lot heal myself too.
I think that's a really welcome invitation. We've already been going on for a couple hours, so probably shouldn't go on for too much longer. But I like the invitation to discuss current events, particularly pressing ones. I'm assuming it's about the ruthless murders in Atlanta. Yeah. And so I would say that one of the readings or one of the concepts that Dana suggested for us for this time too is just D&G's sort of kind of assertion, but well-reasoned assertion that what capitalism does is it decodes, and it's just going to undermine and constantly undermine those social codes that sort of keep us tied to senses of identity and culture and community. And so this constant sort of undermining of that has been subsequently theorized by a lot of people. I think that Bifo Berardi is someone who does this quite a bit. I don't want to put too fine of a point on it. I'm sometimes a little dissatisfied with Bifo because I think that he often sort of paints it with the brush of saying that things are changing too fast or too much, which can give the impression of it being a sort of romantic approach to sort of want to return to something. I don't think he really wants that, but I think it's just sort of the form of argumentation sort of lulls him into that sometimes. And so Bifo does have a book that I haven't read yet called Heroes, in which he tries to theorize this sort of like ongoing notion of suicide bombers and assassins and people who just kind of like lose it because they're sort of feeling unmoored. And I think that really points us toward a direction of things that we're going to increasingly see. Tikkun had their own sort of way of talking about it, jokingly talking about the Leopold Blooms of the world, who just sort of like lose it at a certain point and then sort of rebel against their circumstances. But there are sort of like an empty nihilism in which it just sort of explodes. When I first started reading it, there was a guy who was like just about to retire and his like retirement fund fucked up and he blamed the IRS for it. So he flew his own personal plane into an IRS building in Texas, the tax people. It was just like, how, why, or whatever, Fortunately, no one was hurt in it, but it was just completely absurd. And so I think that what it points to is there are ongoing systems that are going to keep just tearing us apart because of this, and that there's no immediate solution to it other than the idea that simply just calling for communities or respecting cultural identity or something like that are going to fail. They're going to fail, and they're going to keep failing because there's a system that needs to and wants to continue undermining them. And so we need some sort of way of addressing it. And I'd love to hear if other people have reflections on the event or the instance. Yeah, Brendan.
Yeah, not on that particular event or instance, but I have read Heroes. Bifo often reminds me of like the fun uncle of late 20th century theory. So he's not always 100% correct, I think, in where he lands. But one thing that I really enjoyed about that book and that I would recommend is his discussion of semio-capital and financialization and its effect on like the groundlessness of modern life. I think in that's him just like kind of hitting all his notes perfectly there. And I also wanted to just kind of suggest, I know Josh often talks about how we need to he would like something that is sort of like a group project that sort of starts to carry us outside of the limits of the group. I was curious if people would be interested in doing some sort of like intra-group publication at the very least, so that we have a chance sometimes to reflect on things. It also doesn't necessarily privilege having a discussion in the moment, but also has a chance for people to respond later after after we've broken for the week or for the 2 weeks or whatever, to have a chance to sort of make their point of view heard.
Hey, I guess to jump in just really fast here. It's funny because I was discussing with some other folks about what happened, the unfortunate events in Atlanta. And they were very outraged almost at the description by the police PR saying, the guy had a bad day. And ironically, it made me immediately think of Tikkun in some ways too, because what does the state fear more than truly random, indiscriminate violence? Like the idea that violence cannot be controlled, that it always has a reason, leaves open the possibility of its ultimate, mediation. So to say that this gentleman cracked and went on a shooting spree is honestly more inconceivable than the idea that he did it for ideological reasons, because at least then we can say there's a bad ideology, and then we can other him as the bad person. I mean, personally, that's where I'm very challenged by pacifism. I'm very challenged by utopianism, because I don't believe there will ever be a stop to indiscriminate, random acts of violence. People are going to snap for whatever reason, regardless of their ideology. And that really is just that notion in the back of our minds, not only that external violence could come to us, but in fact, we could be the perpetrators of it, not even recognizing it. That sort of lack of recognition of what's inside ourselves, as well as the possibility outside of ourselves, that's ultimately what the state has to promise us, right? Or any system afterwards, our anarcho-communist compound or what the fuck ever, like it has to give us this sense of safety from the outside and the other, because we can all agree that we're good people and we would never do such a thing. And that sort of cognitive dissonance and just magical thinking, I guess, not to use the term magic, pejoratively, but that kind of thinking is absolutely crucial to the state. And so when I heard the police chief say he was having a bad day, it's almost like, wow, that's potentially some ultimate truth telling, because maybe he held all these beliefs, but what made this day different than every one of the other days? So yeah, I guess that goes back to the whole human animal, false dichotomy and the rest of that bullshit, but hopefully that brings something.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, for to try and push this back into D&G terminology, it would be like potentials, virtual potentials held in everyone. And it seems like a virtual potential held in every cop's head is that bad day where they hold all these same beliefs and approaches, and due to whatever training or sense of obligation or duty, that they don't do it. And so if any of those things just don't go according to plan one time, then they go do things, which apparently, that's what Jose was saying happened at Bristol as well. A cop goes on a rampage and, abducts a woman and kills her. So yeah, it's not so much the reforms or what are needed as this opportunity to reflect on deeper structural issues. And fortunately, people are doing that a bit. I mean, it's unfortunate that it's events and circumstances like this that push the conversation forward. I think people are finally standing up and paying attention to the forms of anti-Chinese and anti-Asian sentiments that have been circulating for quite a while, trying to understand how this is different than anti-Blackness or issues of colonialism, or it's related to immigration and national status and things like that. But I think that these are absolutely crucial within a D&G framework. I mean, not to bring it back to D&G, but like within frameworks that are often only talk about things like state or capitalism. I think that we do have tools to figure out where they come from that don't just sort of tie it back to notions of government or state or capitalism. I think that there's like these other cultural issues that have been underplayed that we really we dramatically need to sort of get a grasp on very quickly. See, the chat has been really active too. Or do people have any other sort of thoughts on Atlanta or related issues?
I was just going to ask you, Andrew, or anyone else. One of my challenges with reading Those in Atari and Body Without Organs, so Brendan too, is that, but maybe back to Brendan's first comment around these kind of like cautions, is that there is a danger of full self annihilate, or like full kind of like obliteration. And I know suicide is something discussed in other places, but there may be, I don't know, there's connection there too, is that this is, I don't know if I'm reading it right, but that this complete loss of a self or whatever can be also violent. I'm not saying that this person, do you know what I mean? That there's this kind of like this black hole. And yeah, I don't know. I was just making that connection back to Brandon's first comments.
Yeah, one of the things that I find super interesting in them is the discussion of black holes and its relationship to fascism, and also going all the way back to, I think, the first meeting I attended, Dana brought up the fact that there's this relationship between romanticism and suicide that is definitely contextual for the development of fascism, especially in Germany. And so, yeah, I agree. I think like you're always courting death, I guess is the way that they put it, which sounds super metal the first time you read it. But also, like, as you kind of get into it, you kind of like really start to understand what they mean. And for me personally, at least, it was always the thing that sort of made me a little bit shy about trying to engage with theory. So I'm glad that, I found people who like have that same sense of it and know just like what a difficult task it really is. That's all I got.
Yeah, and I think that, part of this comes through E&G's reworking of the death drive against what sort of Lacanians would take. Lacanians would probably see death drive as simple like self-annihilation. And if you've ever met a Lacanian, they're probably like smoking 1 million cigarettes a day and like just like pondering the sort of inevitability of their own, demise, maybe a little too Heideggerian or something. Whereas death in E&G it's not eliminated, it's not gone, right? But that, it's something to accept when it's appropriate, but not allow to take over if it becomes cancerous or fascist. So there's this classic essay, one of the ones that you suggested, I think, where Deleuze, writing in and through Guattari so very early on, is just like, some organizations and some groups and some political parties need to die, and they don't. And they stay around like these zombie-like things, sucking the life out of everybody. And I'm sure so many of you have been a part of some organization that has lost its purpose. You're at a school that doesn't even know what it does anymore. And it just like is miserable, right? And so for them, I think they're very much still trying to capture a sense of joy, sometimes pleasure, even in something as dangerous or scary as like confronting death itself. And so I think that their target is something like the joyless militant, but it doesn't mean that they're anti-militant. It's that there's a different sense of militantism. But I think that they also sort of like look above and below themselves too, all the way down to the molecular, to the earth itself. What's your commitment to the earth? And then above yourself to a collective or to something that is common that you hold with others. And not in this phenomenological sense of like an other for whom you have a duty or an obligation to, but like an other just in a sense of that that there's something above and beyond your status as just as a subject yourself. And so I think that that's something that we need to sit with. I mean, for me, I'm coming out with a book that uses guerrilla theory as a big motivating factor to it. So, I'm certainly not shying away from militancy. And so I think that, I'd never condemn someone who takes extreme risks. I don't like their Leninist aspect, but I like a lot of the sort of militant groups in Germany in the 70s, for instance. I think that there's something really interesting about what they're doing, claiming that, Nazis have infiltrated all of Germany even after the Nazification, and they respond with all kinds of things like printing false currency, printing false metro tickets, kidnapping politicians, killing some of them, doing bombings, usually not hurting people. Like, I'm super fascinated by this. I am disgusted when my enemies do it, but when my allies engage in these sorts of actions, I think it's something to listen to and to figure out why and how, because often we just farm out these forms of force an action to a state that does it on our behalf that we have no influence and control over. So, you know, I don't think I've ever been a pacifist, but I think that it's something to sort of understand who does violence work, what is the role of violence, certainly not to try and wash our hands of violence, and to understand like what are the appropriate ways to use it in a way that might be political and secondarily maybe also ethical. Big issues. So I think before we go today, would love to hear any ideas or suggestions on what to read for next time. I know Liliana had suggested a newly translated Bembe book that might be some great stuff to look at. Oh, Kiyoshi is mentioning Peter Gelderloos. Love How Nonviolence Protects the State. He's written some more recent ones in which he softened his position, which I guess is appropriate. You get older and you do more research, but you know, I love just the force of the original. Kamat, yeah, some Jacques Kamat. I know maybe we had promised some Fanon from last time or something, and then we didn't follow through. So maybe we can find something sort of Fanon related, maybe some Abembe, maybe sneak in some Kamat or something else too. You know, there's a really interesting set of readings on Fanon that are going around in Black Study right now too. You know, I guess kind of Fred Moten shuttles between the various approaches, but you know, the Afro-pessimists have been rereading Fanon outside of the framework of colonialism and instead within a framework of anti-Blackness that I think is very provocative. I think that there's also just original Fanon on like less political questions and more psychological questions that might be kind of interesting too. I don't know. I've seen a lot in the chat, just sort of following these things. Cool. We'll follow up about it. And if anyone wants to present on any of those, I mean, that's what happened with Brendan, which we really loved. You know, like Brendan reached out and said, "Hey, I'd love to sort of present on these pages." People have pages of something that they'd like to present. We'd love to sort of make an opportunity to foreground people's voices and other approaches.
You can send an email if you cannot decide now. You can send an email at any time.
Well, let's thank Brendan for an amazing presentation. Pat each other. You know, we had a really wide-ranging session this week. Yeah.
Thanks again, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brendan.
Great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining Quiver. For more, visit our website at ourquiver.org, where you can RSVP for future events and see readings. We also ask you to subscribe while you're there to our newsletter. Till later, Quiver.